I'm 73 years old, and at my own retirement party, I watched my son spike my drink with sedatives, so I switched our glasses and let him drink it instead. My name is Patricia Brennan, and after 5 decades as a senior accountant catching embezzlers, fraudsters, and corporate thieves, I never thought I'd need those skills to catch my own child. But there I was, standing in the elegant event hall where my colleagues had gathered to celebrate 32 years of service, watching my firstborn son poison me. You need to understand something about being a woman my age. People see the gray hair, the reading glasses on a chain, the sensible shoes, and they make assumptions. They think we're fragile, confused, easy targets. My son Brandon certainly thought so. He looked at his 73-year-old mother and saw dollar signs wrapped in vulnerability. He was wrong. That night, surrounded by champagne toasts and congratulatory speeches about my brilliant career detecting financial crimes, I detected the biggest crime of all. And unlike the corporate frauds I'd spent decades unraveling, this one was personal. This one was family. This one would destroy everything I'd built over 7 decades of life. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, how a retirement party turned into a crime scene, how a mother's instinct collided with an accountant's training, and how the poison my son meant for me became his own downfall. But more importantly, I'm going to show you that underestimating a woman because of her age is a mistake that costs more than money. It costs everything. Stay with me through this story, because what unfolded over those next few weeks taught me something I hadn't learned in 50 years of auditing. Fortune 500 companies, sometimes the biggest frauds happen at your own dinner table, committed by people who once called you mommy. And if this resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated because of a number on your birth certificate, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because stories like mine need to be heard, and voices like ours deserve to be amplified. Now, let me take you back to that September evening, when everything changed. The retirement party was everything I'd imagined for 32 years. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, a slideshow of my career highlights projected on the wall, photos of me in my 20s with an adding machine, progressing through decades to my final position as senior forensic accountant. My managing partner gave a speech about how I'd saved the firm millions by catching a CFO's embezzlement scheme back in 2003. People laughed at the stories, clinked glasses, told me I'd earned this rest, but I wasn't watching the slideshow. I was watching my son. Brandon had arrived late, which wasn't unusual. At 47, he'd always been the type to make an entrance, expensive suit, confident handshake, that smile that had charmed teachers and girlfriends since he was 16. He was my firstborn, the one who'd made me a mother, the baby I'd rocked through colic and walked to his first day of kindergarten, my Tommy's pride and joy. He kissed my cheek, told me I looked beautiful, asked where his wife Melissa was sitting. Normal son behavior, loving. Even then, I saw his eyes. You don't spend 50 years reading financial statements without learning to read people. Numbers tell stories, and so do eyes. Brandon's eyes were doing what I call the audit scan, that nervous darting movement people make when they're about to hide something in column B while you're looking at column A. I'd seen it 1,000 times across boardroom tables, right before someone tried to explain why the inventory numbers didn't match. I watched him excuse himself toward the beverage table. My table was near the front. His was 2 rows back on the right. I'd arranged the seating myself because Melissa didn't get along with my daughter Sarah, and I wanted to avoid drama. Smart planning, I'd thought. Tactical spacing. Brandon stopped at the drinks table, picked up a champagne flute, examined it against the light like he was checking for smudges. Then his hand went into his jacket pocket. That's when my heart started hammering against my ribs like it was trying to warn the rest of my body. His fingers emerged with something small, a vial, maybe, or a folded paper. I couldn't see clearly from 15 feet away, but I saw the motion, quick, practiced, guilty. He glanced around the room, and I immediately looked down at my program, pretending to read about the dessert menu. When I looked up again through my peripheral vision, a skill you develop when you're auditing people who don't know they're being audited, he was tapping something, white and powdery, into a champagne glass. My champagne glass. The one with the small chip on the rim that I'd pointed out to the waiter earlier, joking that it gave it character. Brandon set down whatever he'd used, slipped it back in his pocket, and walked away. He didn't take the glass with him. He left it there, marked for me, and returned to his table where Melissa was checking her phone. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, my mind doing what it does best, calculating probabilities, analyzing scenarios, running risk assessments. This was my son, my child, the boy I'd nursed through chickenpox and driven to baseball practice. There had to be another explanation. But I'd also spent 3 decades investigating people who seemed trustworthy: the beloved uncle who'd embezzled from the family business, the charitable board member who'd stolen from the nonprofit, the friendly CFO who'd bankrupted his own employees' pensions. Trust was a luxury I'd learned to separate from evidence. I stood up, smoothed my burgundy dress, the one Tommy had loved, the one I'd saved for special occasions, and walked to the beverage table. My hands were steady. They'd been steady through Tommy's funeral, through my mother's dementia, through depositions where men twice my size tried to intimidate me. They'd be steady now. The champagne glass with the chipped rim sat exactly where Brandon had left it, slightly separated from the others. I picked it up, examined it in the light like I was admiring the bubbles. Then I glanced at the seating chart in my mind. Brandon's table, 2 rows back, right side. His glass would be there, probably untouched. He'd been too busy poisoning mine to drink his own. I carried my compromised glass toward my table, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I took a casual detour past Brandon's table, commenting to Melissa about how lovely she looked. As I passed behind Brandon's chair, I set down my chipped glass and picked up his identical one. The switch took less than 3 seconds. Years of reorganizing audit files had made me efficient with my hands. Then I returned to my seat and waited. The thing about being 73 is that people don't really see you anymore. You become part of the background, like furniture or wallpaper. I could sit there, watching my son, and he never once looked at me with suspicion. Why would he? I was just his elderly mother, enjoying her retirement party, probably thinking about cruise ships and gardening. 20 minutes later, Brandon stood up to refill his glass, except he picked up the wrong one. My original one, the one he'd poisoned. I watched him drink it in 3 large gulps, probably nervous, probably eager to get whatever plan he had into motion. I sipped my safe champagne and waited for the mathematics of chemistry to do their work. 15 minutes after that, Brandon's voice got louder. He was telling some story about a golf game, laughing too hard, gesturing wildly. Melissa touched his arm, concerned. He brushed her off. 25 minutes in, he stood up too fast and grabbed the table edge. His words started slurring, not like alcohol, but like something deeper, something that made his tongue too thick for his mouth. 30 minutes after drinking from my glass, my son, my firstborn baby, collapsed into his chair, his eyes rolling back, his body going limp. The party erupted into chaos. People screamed. Someone called 911. Melissa was crying, shouting that he'd only had 2 glasses, that he never drank like this, that something was wrong. I stood there, holding my safe champagne, watching the paramedics rush in, and while everyone else panicked, I calmly walked to the coat check, retrieved my purse, and took out a Ziploc bag I'd brought for leftover cake. I went back to Brandon's table. Everyone was crowded around him. Nobody was paying attention to an old woman, and I picked up that chipped champagne glass. The evidence, the proof of what my son had tried to do to his own mother. I sealed it carefully, wiped the outside with a napkin to preserve only the contents, and tucked it deep into my purse. Then I followed the ambulance to the hospital, playing the worried mother perfectly, because that's what 73 years of life teaches you: how to perform the role people expect while you calculate your next move. As I sat in that emergency room waiting area, listening to Melissa sob about how this made no sense, I pulled out my phone. My finger always steady, dialed a number I hadn't called in almost a year. Vincent Caruso answered on the second ring. Vincent had been Tommy's college roommate, later a criminal defense attorney, now semi-retired but still sharp as a blade. He'd handled our estate planning, attended Tommy's funeral, sent me a card every Christmas. I kept my voice low, barely a whisper. "Vincent, it's Patricia Brennan. I need you to analyze something for me, tonight. And I need absolute discretion." There was a pause. Then Vincent, who'd known me for 40 years, who'd watched me dissect corporate fraud cases over dinner parties, who understood exactly what kind of woman I was, said just 3 words. "What did you catch?" Vincent met me in the hospital parking lot at 11:30 that night. Brandon was stable sedated, ironically, by the very drugs he'd tried to use on me, and Melissa was inside with him, still hysterical with confusion. I'd played the concerned mother for 3 exhausting hours, but now, under the fluorescent parking lot lights, I could finally drop the mask. I handed Vincent the Ziploc bag through his car window. He held it up to the light, examining the residue at the bottom of the champagne glass, and I saw his jaw tighten in that way it did when he was processing something ugly. He told me he'd have it analyzed by a private lab he used for criminal cases, that I should expect results within 48 hours, and that I shouldn't confront anyone until we knew exactly what we were dealing with. Then he looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen too many awful things in his 40 years of criminal law, and told me he was sorry, that no mother should have to do what I was doing. I told him that no son should make his mother have to do it. The next morning, Melissa called me at 7 a.m., her voice scraped raw from crying. She said Brandon was awake, but confused, that the doctors were running tests, that they'd found benzodiazepines in his system, heavy-duty sedatives, and they couldn't understand where they'd come from. She swore he didn't take pills, didn't do drugs, that this was completely inexplicable. I made sympathetic noises and promised to come to the hospital soon. Then I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Brandon with his algebra homework 35 years ago, and I thought about what comes next. Here's what 50 years of forensic accounting teaches you. Follow the money. Always follow the money. People don't poison their mothers for emotional reasons. They do it for financial ones. So I needed to find out exactly how deep Brandon's problems went. I called Melissa back an hour later with a story I'd carefully constructed. I told her I'd been so shaken by Brandon's collapse that I couldn't sleep, that I kept thinking about family medical history, whether there was something genetic we'd missed. I asked if I could come by their house to look through Brandon's medical records, maybe find some clue that could help the doctors. Melissa, desperate for answers and still believing I was just a worried elderly mother, gave me their house key immediately. She said she'd stay at the hospital with Brandon, that I should take my time, that anything I could find would help. I drove to their house, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in an expensive neighborhood, the kind of place that screamed success, and I let myself in, like I'd done dozens of times for family dinners and birthday parties. Except this time, I wasn't looking for the bathroom or offering to help with dishes. I was looking for evidence. I started with Brandon's home office. He'd always been proud of it: mahogany desk, leather chair, wall of books he'd probably never read but that looked impressive on video calls. I sat down in his chair, opened his laptop, and found it password protected. Expected, but Brandon had always been predictable, even as a child. I tried his birthday, wrong. I tried his wedding anniversary, wrong. Then I tried the name of his childhood dog, the golden retriever he'd loved more than anything when he was 12. The computer unlocked. What I found in his files made my blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with my age. Spreadsheets showing investment losses, email chains with venture capital firms, promissory notes for loans I'd never heard about. My son, my careful, responsible firstborn, had lost $680,000 in a cryptocurrency scheme that had collapsed 8 months ago. $680,000, nearly $500,000 more than his annual salary. Money he didn't have, money he'd borrowed from people who expected repayment. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the folder labeled "Mother" buried 3 layers deep in his financial files. I opened it with hands that were finally starting to shake. Inside were documents that made me understand exactly what my son had planned for me. There were emails between Brandon and Melissa going back for months, discussing my advanced age and probable cognitive decline. There was research about early onset dementia symptoms, about power of attorney procedures, about guardianship laws in our state. There was a draft email to Dr. Richard Holbrook, a psychiatrist. I'd never heard of, outlining a consultation fee for providing an expert opinion on my mental competency. There was a contact for an elder care attorney named Patricia Vance, with notes about emergency conservatorship proceedings and expedited timeframes for protecting vulnerable seniors. And then I found the email that made everything crystal clear. It was from Brandon to Melissa, dated 3 weeks before my retirement party. He laid out the entire plan like a corporate proposal, step by careful step. He would sedate me publicly at the party, enough to make me confused, disoriented, but not enough to obviously harm me. They would take me to Dr. Holbrook immediately, claiming I'd had an episode. Holbrook, for a substantial fee, would diagnose acute dementia. Attorney Vance would file emergency conservatorship papers while I was still mentally compromised. And once Brandon had legal control of my finances, he'd liquidate my $1.4 million in assets to cover his debts and set aside appropriate care costs for me. The phrase "appropriate care costs" made me physically ill. I knew what it meant: the cheapest nursing facility they could find, Somewhere I'd be warehoused and forgotten while my money Tommy and I had worked 50 years to build paid for Brandon's mistakes. They'd planned to erase me, not kill me, which would be too obvious. Just erase the person I was and turn me into a confused old woman who couldn't argue, couldn't fight back, couldn't even remember she'd once been Patricia Brennan, CPA, fraud investigator, woman who'd built a life. I printed everything, every email, every document, every piece of their conspiracy. Then I photographed Brandon's handwritten notes in his desk drawer notes about timing, about which of my assets would liquidate fastest, about how to handle my other 3 children's inevitable questions. I was putting the files back exactly as I'd found them when my phone buzzed. Vincent's name lit up the screen. I answered, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me the lab results were back, that my champagne glass had contained enough benzodiazepines to sedate me for hours, possibly dangerous given my age and the alcohol mixture. He said this was attempted assault against an elderly person, a felony with serious prison time. Then he asked me what I wanted to do. I looked around Brandon's office at his fake books and expensive furniture bought with money he didn't have, at the computer that held evidence of his plan to destroy me, and I thought about how he'd looked at me at that party, not with love, not with gratitude for the mother who'd raised him, but with calculation, like I was a balance sheet to be adjusted. I told Vincent I wanted to involve the police. I told him I had documentation showing premeditated fraud and conspiracy. And I told him I wanted Brandon to understand that his elderly, supposedly declining mother had just caught him in a trap of his own making. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me he'd contact a detective he trusted, that I should bring all the evidence to his office tomorrow, and that I should be prepared for my family to fall apart. I hung up and sat in my son's chair, in his house that would probably be foreclosed on within a year, and I let myself cry for exactly 5 minutes, not because I was scared. Not because I was hurt, though God knows I was, but because I'd just realized something that changed everything. They weren't going to stop with trying once. If this plan had failed, they would have tried again, and again, until they succeeded in making me disappear into some fog of manufactured dementia, until I was too confused and medicated to fight back. My son had tried to poison me, and if I hadn't switched those glasses, I'd be the one in that hospital bed right now, being evaluated by a corrupt psychiatrist, losing everything I was. They thought I was easy prey because I was 73. They thought wrong. The next 48 hours required the performance of my life. I'd spent 5 decades reading people, catching liars, spotting inconsistencies in their stories. Now I had to become what I'd always hunted: someone, hiding the truth behind a carefully constructed facade. I visited Brandon in the hospital every day, playing the worried mother so convincingly that even I almost believed it. I brought him homemade soup, fluffed his pillows, asked the nurses questions about his recovery, with just the right amount of elderly concern in my voice. Melissa would pat my hand and assure me he'd be fine, that the doctors still couldn't explain what happened, but that he was getting stronger. I let her pat my hand. I let her treat me like I needed comforting, and I watched everything. The thing about being a woman my age is that people talk around you like you're not quite there. They'll have entire conversations in your presence, discussing things they'd never say if they thought you were really listening, really understanding. It's like you become partially invisible once you hit 70, still physically present, but somehow less real to them. Brandon and Melissa made that mistake constantly. On the second day, while I was supposedly dozing in the hospital room, her eyes closed, breathing steady, the picture of an exhausted elderly woman, they had a whispered conversation that confirmed everything I'd found in Brandon's office. Melissa told him they needed to figure out what went wrong, that the dosage should have worked, that maybe they'd miscalculated my weight. Brandon, still groggy but recovering, told her they couldn't try again so soon, that they needed to wait until things settled down. Try again. Those 2 words settled into my chest like ice. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing even, and I listened to my son and his wife discuss their next attempt to incapacitate me, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a human being, rather than his mother. Melissa wondered aloud if they should just accelerate the dementia narrative without sedating me first. Maybe start telling my other children I'd been acting confused lately, plant seeds of doubt. Brandon told her that wouldn't work fast enough, that his creditors were getting aggressive, that they needed access to my accounts within the next 60 days or they'd lose the house. I learned more in those 10 minutes of pretending to sleep than I could have discovered in weeks of investigation. They were desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, but they're also dangerous. They'd already proven they were willing to drug me. What else would they do if they felt cornered? When I opened my eyes and stretched, yawning like I'd actually been napping, they immediately shifted into their performance. Brandon smiled weakly and told me I should go home and rest. Melissa agreed enthusiastically, saying I looked tired, that I shouldn't be pushing myself at my age. I told them I was fine, that a mother's place was with her son, and I saw something flicker across Brandon's face. Guilt, frustration. I couldn't tell, but I filed it away in my mental ledger of evidence. That evening, I met Vincent at his office. I brought him everything I'd printed from Brandon's computer, along with a detailed timeline I'd constructed of their planning. Vincent sat behind his desk, the same desk where Tommy and I had signed our wills 20 years ago, and read through the documents with the focused intensity of a man who'd prosecuted hundreds of criminals. When he finished, he looked at me with something like awe. He told me this was an airtight case, that I'd gathered evidence better than most professional investigators, that any prosecutor would be thrilled to have documentation this thorough. Then he told me he'd already contacted Detective Sarah Morrison, someone he'd worked with for 15 years, someone who specialized in elder abuse cases. Elder abuse. Hearing those words applied to my situation made something twist in my stomach. I'd never thought of myself as elderly, never identified with those news stories about seniors being scammed or exploited. I was Patricia Brennan. I was sharp, capable, independent, but legally, technically, I was a 73-year-old woman whose son had tried to drug her. That made me a victim of elder abuse, whether I liked the label or not. Detective Morrison wanted to meet with me the next morning. Vincent told me she'd need to hear everything in my own words, that she'd probably want to set up a confrontation with Brandon while he was still in the hospital, while he was vulnerable and more likely to break under questioning. I went home that night and sat in the living room Tommy and I had furnished together 40 years ago. Wedding photos on the mantel, baby pictures of all 4 kids, Brandon's kindergarten graduation photo, gap-toothed and grinning. I'd raised that little boy. I'd taught him right from wrong, honesty from deception, love from manipulation. Where had I failed him? Or had I not failed at all? Had he simply become someone I couldn't recognize, someone who looked at his mother and saw nothing but a bank account waiting to be drained? My phone rang. It was my daughter Sarah, Brandon's younger sister by 3 years. She asked how Brandon was doing, if the doctors had figured out what happened. I almost told her everything right then, almost unloaded the whole ugly truth into her sympathetic ear. But I held back, because I needed to control how this information came out. I needed my other children to hear the truth from the police, with evidence, so they couldn't dismiss it as a misunderstanding or elderly paranoia. If I told Sarah now, Brandon and Melissa might find out I knew. They might run, or destroy evidence, or lawyer up before Detective Morrison could question them. So I lied to my daughter. I told her Brandon was recovering fine, that it was all very mysterious, that I was just glad he was okay. And when we hung up, I added Sarah's name to the list of people I'd have to apologize to later for keeping them in the dark. The next morning, I met Detective Morrison at Vincent's office. She was maybe 45, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen too much human cruelty. She shook my hand with a grip that was firm but not patronizing. She treated me like a witness, not a fragile old lady, and I appreciated that more than she could know. I walked her through everything: the retirement party, the switched glasses, the hospital, Brandon's office, the emails, the planned conspiracy. I spoke clearly, chronologically, without emotion. This was a deposition, essentially, and I'd given enough of those in my career to know how to present facts without letting feelings muddy them. When I finished, Detective Morrison looked at Vincent and said something that made my heart race. She told him this was one of the most thoroughly documented elder abuse cases she'd ever seen, that most victims couldn't articulate what happened to them or didn't have proof. She said I'd essentially built the entire case for her. Then she told me what happened next would be difficult. She'd go to the hospital with other officers. They'd question Brandon formally, present him with the evidence. Given how solid my documentation was, he'd likely confess most criminals did when confronted with proof that complete. But I needed to be there. I needed to face my son while he was questioned. I asked her why. Why did I need to watch my child's world fall apart? She met my eyes and told me that predators who target the elderly count on their victims being too ashamed or too loyal to follow through. She said me being there, looking Brandon in the eye while the truth came out, would show him that I wasn't the confused old woman he'd counted on. It would show him exactly who he'd tried to destroy. So, 2 hours later, I walked back into that hospital room, the same room where I'd played concerned mother for 2 days, but this time, Detective Morrison walked beside me, and 2 uniformed officers stood by the door. Brandon was sitting up in bed, looking better, almost ready for discharge. Melissa was beside him, scrolling through her phone. They both looked up when we entered, and I watched confusion cross their faces, confusion that shifted into fear when they saw the badges. Detective Morrison introduced herself and informed Brandon he was being questioned regarding a serious crime. She read him his rights while Melissa's face went chalk white. Then Morrison did something I hadn't expected. She gestured to me and told Brandon that his mother had something to show him. I stepped forward, pulled out the folder I'd prepared, and set it on his hospital tray. Inside were printouts of every email, every plan, every piece of evidence of their conspiracy. On top was the lab report confirming the sedatives in the champagne glass. I watched my son's face as he looked through the documents. I watched him realize that every word he'd written, every plan he'd made, every discussion he'd thought was private had it all. His hands started shaking. Melissa made a small sound like a wounded animal, and I spoke for the first time since entering the room. I told Brandon I'd switched our glasses. I told him he'd drugged himself. I told him I'd watched him drink poison meant for me, and I'd let him, because I needed to know what he was capable of. I needed to see how far my own son would go. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a heartbeat in that room. Then Brandon did exactly what Detective Morrison predicted. He broke. His face crumpled and he started talking, admitting everything, explaining about the debts, about the desperation, about how they'd convinced themselves I wouldn't really be hurt. I'd just be taken care of in a facility, that it wasn't really that terrible, that they'd had no choice, as if I'd forced him to try to destroy me. Melissa was crying, begging me to understand, swearing they'd never meant for things to go this far. But I'd read their emails. I knew exactly how far they'd meant things to go. Detective Morrison let them talk themselves into deeper confession, recording every word. When they finally ran out of justifications, she informed them they'd both be arrested: Brandon for attempted assault on an elderly person and conspiracy to commit fraud. Melissa as an accessory and co-conspirator. Brandon looked at me then with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Not love, not even hate. Just the cold realization that he'd miscalculated catastrophically, that the elderly mother he'd dismissed as weak had been 10 steps ahead of him the entire time. I turned to leave, and Brandon called out my name, not Mom, just my name. He asked me how I could do this to him, turn him in to the police, destroy his life. I stopped at the door but didn't turn around. I told him I'd asked myself the same question. How could he do this to me? The woman who'd given him life, raised him, loved him unconditionally for 47 years. The difference, I said, was that I hadn't actually done anything to him. He'd done it all to himself. Then I walked out of that hospital room and didn't look back, because some betrayals are too deep for maternal instinct to bridge. The arrest happened within 24 hours. Detective Morrison moved quickly. She told me later that elder abuse cases require speed because evidence can disappear and victims can be pressured into dropping charges, but there was no pressuring me. I'd spent 50 years standing firm against corporate executives who tried to intimidate me out of fraud investigations. My own son wouldn't succeed where they'd failed. Brandon was charged with attempted assault on an elderly person, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted theft by deception. Melissa faced charges as an accessory and co-conspirator. The bail was set high, $100,000 each, because the judge considered them flight risks given the financial desperation. Detective Morrison outlined in her report they couldn't make bail. Neither could their families, apparently. So they sat in county jail while I tried to understand how my life had arrived at this moment. My other 3 children, Sierra, Michael, and Jenna Fortis, descended on my house within hours of the arrests, making the local news. They'd seen the headlines. Local accountant's son arrested for attempting to drug mother at retirement party. The story was spreading through our community like wildfire. And my phone hadn't stopped ringing. Sarah cried. Michael was furious. pacing my living room like a caged animal, demanding to know why I hadn't told them sooner. Jennifer just held my hand and stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time, not as their mother, but as a woman who'd survived something unthinkable. I told them everything, every detail I'd kept locked away for days. And when I finished, Michael said something that cut through all the emotion in the room. He asked me if I knew why Brandon had done it. That was the question, wasn't it? The money was obvious. $680,000 in debt would drive anyone to desperation. But that wasn't the whole answer. People face financial ruin every day without trying to poison their mothers. There had to be something deeper, something that made Brandon look at me and see not a person but a resource to be exploited. I spent the next week digging into that question. Vincent helped me access financial records through legal discovery once criminal charges are filed. Suddenly, all those private documents become available for investigation. What I found painted a picture of my son I'd never wanted to see. The cryptocurrency losses were just the beginning. Brandon had been living beyond his means for years. The big house, the luxury cars, the country club membership, the private school for his kids. He'd been maintaining an image of success that his actual income couldn't support, borrowing against future earnings that never materialized. But the real revelation came when I found his social media history, which Detective Morrison had subpoenaed as part of the investigation. I'd never paid much attention to Brandon's online presence. I had a Facebook account I barely used, and the whole digital world felt like something for younger generations. What I discovered made me physically sick. For the past 3 years, Brandon had been posting in online forums about inheritance planning and dealing with aging parents who won't let go of control. He'd written dozens of posts under a pseudonym, but the details matched our family to precisely to be anyone else, asking questions about how to get elderly parents declared incompetent, how to challenge a will, how to access retirement accounts when the owner was mentally declining. The responses he'd gotten were chilling. Other users had shared strategies, recommended corrupt medical professionals, discussed ways to accelerate the process when elderly parents were being stubborn about their finances. It was like a support group for financial predators, all of them justifying their actions by painting their elderly parents as obstacles rather than people. In one post from 18 months ago, Brandon had written something that made me understand the true depth of his betrayal. He'd complained that I was wasting my retirement savings on frivolous travel plans, when I should be thinking about my legacy and securing my grandchildren's future. He'd written that I was being selfish by planning to spend money on myself instead of preserving it for my family. My family. As if I wasn't part of my own family. As if I'd stopped being a person with wants and needs the moment I turned 70. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about Brandon's debts. This was about a fundamental belief that I no longer had the right to my own life. That at 73, my purpose was to sit quietly, preserve resources, and wait to die, so my children could inherit the money Tommy and I had worked 50 years to build through careful saving, smart investments, sacrifice and planning. Brandon saw it as already his. My continued existence, my plans to travel and enjoy my retirement, were obstacles between him and what he believed he was owed. I shared these findings with Vincent, and he told me something that helped me see the bigger picture. He said that in his 40 years practicing law, he'd seen this attitude more and more: adult children who viewed their elderly parents' assets as a pre-inheritance, who became resentful when those parents dared to actually enjoy the money they'd earned. The elderly were supposed to be careful, conservative, focused on leaving something behind. If they wanted to spend money on themselves, they were being irresponsible or losing their faculties. Vincent told me about cases where families had fought to declare competent parents incompetent simply because those parents made financial choices the children didn't approve of: selling the family home to travel, donating to charity, spending down assets on experiences rather than preserving them. The assumption was that once you reached a certain age, your money was no longer really yours. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen and thought about the trips Tommy and I had postponed. When we retire, we'd always said, when the kids are settled, when we have time. But Tommy died 6 years ago, and all that waiting had earned us nothing but regrets. I'd promised myself at his funeral that I wouldn't postpone living anymore, that I'd take those trips, see those places, spend the money we'd saved, because what good was money in the bank when you were in the ground? Brandon had tried to rob me of that. Not just the money, but the time, the experiences, the life I had left. And suddenly I understood something that changed how I saw everything. Brandon wasn't just greedy, he was angry. Angry that I was still here, still independent, still planning a future instead of quietly fading into the background. Every trip I planned, every investment I managed myself, every decision I made without consulting him, it was a reminder that I wasn't the declining, dependent mother he needed me to be. The poisoning wasn't just about accessing my money quickly. It was about putting me in my place, making me the helpless, confused old woman he'd already decided I should be. The next day, I went to visit my grandchildren, Brandon's 3 kids, ages 12, 9, and 6. They didn't know their parents had been arrested yet. Their maternal grandmother was watching them, and she'd told them Brandon and Melissa were away on a trip. I sat with those kids in their living room, the living room I'd visited for birthday parties and Christmases, and I looked at their innocent faces. They had no idea their father had tried to destroy their grandmother. They had no idea their college funds were gone, gambled away on cryptocurrency schemes. They had no idea that within a year, they'd probably lose this house, lose their school, lose the life they knew. And I realized something that steeled my resolve completely. If I'd let Brandon succeed, if I'd let him drug me and declare me incompetent and steal my assets, these kids would have learned a terrible lesson. They would have learned that elderly people don't matter, that grandmothers are resources, not people, that when you need money, you take it from whoever is weakest, even if that person is family. I couldn't let that be Brandon's legacy to his own children. So I made a decision that would shape everything that came next. I called Vincent and told him I wanted to set up educational trusts for Brandon's kids and for all my grandchildren, funded immediately, structured so Brandon and Melissa could never touch them. College funds that would survive whatever legal or financial destruction was coming. But I also told Vincent I wanted those trusts to include something unusual. I wanted each grandchild, when they turned 18, to receive a letter from me explaining exactly what happened. Not to poison them against their father, but to teach them the lesson Brandon had refused to learn, that every person, at every age, deserves dignity, that money is never worth destroying family for, and that underestimating someone because of their age is a mistake that costs everything. Vincent drafted the trusts within a week. I signed them in his office, funding them with $400,000 of my own money Brandon had tried to steal, now secured for the grandchildren he'd gambled away. And as I signed each document, I thought about how Brandon's greed had actually ensured his children would be provided for despite his failures. The money he'd tried to steal would educate his kids. The inheritance he'd tried to claim prematurely would shape his children's future, just not in the way he'd planned. There's a kind of justice in that, a poetry that my accountant's brain appreciated even as my mother's heart broke. Because at the end of the day, Brandon's true motivation wasn't just financial desperation. It was the belief that I'd outlived my usefulness, that at 73, I was supposed to step aside, stop living my own life, and exist only to serve my children's financial needs. He'd learned that lesson from somewhere. From our culture, maybe, that treats aging as a disease and elderly people as burdens. From online forums full of people who'd convinced each other that their parents' money was already theirs. From a society that measures human worth in productivity and sees retirement as the beginning of obsolescence. But he was about to learn a different lesson, one I'd be teaching from a courtroom, with evidence folders and testimony and consequences that would reshape all our lives. At 73, I wasn't obsolete. I wasn't declining. I wasn't a resource to be managed or an obstacle to be removed. I was Patricia Brennan, and I was just getting started. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the arrest. Vincent explained that this was when a judge would determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial, though with the documentation I'd provided and Brandon's recorded confession at the hospital, that was essentially a formality. But those 3 weeks gave me time to prepare for something I hadn't fully considered: the public nature of what was happening. Our family drama was becoming community knowledge, and I quickly learned that being the victim in an elder abuse case came with its own complicated social dynamics. Some people treated me like I was fragile, suddenly speaking louder and slower, as if being targeted by my son had somehow actually diminished my mental capacity. Others avoided me entirely, uncomfortable with the ugliness of family betrayal. And then there were the ones who asked intrusive questions disguised as concern, wanting details they could gossip about over coffee. But there was one group I hadn't expected, other elderly people who reached out to share their own stories. The woman from my book club whose daughter had forged her signature on a reverse mortgage, the man from church whose son had stolen his identity and opened credit cards, the retired teacher whose family had her declared incompetent because she'd started dating again at 75, and they thought she was being taken advantage of. These stories poured out like confessions, whispered in grocery store aisles and over coffee at the senior center. People who'd never reported what happened to them because they were ashamed, or because they didn't want to destroy their families, or because they'd been convinced they were overreacting. One woman, 81 years old with eyes that had seen too much, told me something I'll never forget. She said that her son had stolen $200,000 from her investment account over 5 years. And when she confronted him, he'd told her she was getting confused, that she'd probably given him that money and forgotten. He'd gaslighted her so successfully that she'd almost believed him, almost accepted that her mind was failing, until her accountant noticed the discrepancies. She never reported him. She just quietly changed her accounts and never spoke to him again. And she'd spent the last 6 years wondering if she'd done the right thing, protecting a thief because he was her child. Looking into her eyes, I understood something crucial. By prosecuting Brandon, by refusing to protect him from the consequences of his actions, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every elderly person who'd been told they were confused when they were actually being robbed. Every senior who'd been dismissed as paranoid when they were actually being targeted. This realization led me to the decisive resource I hadn't known I needed: my voice. Vincent suggested I consider speaking to a local journalist who'd covered elder abuse cases before, a reporter named Marcus Chen who worked for the regional newspaper. Vincent said that getting my story out there, told accurately and in my own words, might help other victims recognize what was happening to them. I agreed to the interview, and Marcus came to my house on a Tuesday afternoon. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, but he listened with an intensity that reminded me of the junior accountants I used to mentor. He didn't interrupt, didn't treat me like I was fragile, just took notes and asked intelligent questions. When I finished telling him the whole story, he set down his pen and told me something that surprised me. He said his own grandmother had been financially exploited by a caregiver, and the family hadn't realized until after she died and they'd discovered her accounts had been drained. He'd become a journalist partly to investigate these cases, to shine light on crimes that often happened in the shadows of family privacy. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday paper with the headline, "Retired Accountant Uses Career Skills to Catch Son's Alleged Poisoning Attempt." It was fair, factual, and it didn't sensationalize. Marcus had captured both the crime and the larger issue: how society's dismissal of elderly people creates opportunities for exploitation. The response was overwhelming. The newspaper received hundreds of letters and emails. Local TV stations called wanting interviews. But more importantly, the district attorney's office contacted Vincent to say they'd received over 24 calls from other families reporting similar situations: adult children exploiting elderly parents, using age-related stereotypes to cover financial crimes. That's when I realized the decisive resource wasn't just my documentation or my testimony. It was the visibility. By refusing to be ashamed, by telling my story publicly, I'd created something Brandon couldn't fight against: public scrutiny. His crime wasn't happening in the shadows anymore. It was happening in courtrooms and newspapers and community conversations. But I needed one more resource to ensure justice, and it came from an unexpected place. 3 days after the article ran, I received a call from a woman named Dr. Alina Vasquez. She introduced herself as a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations. Essentially, she was the kind of Dr. Brandon and Melissa had planned to use against me. Except she was legitimate. Dr. Vasquez told me she'd read the article and was horrified by the mention of Dr. Richard Holbrook, the psychiatrist Brandon had contacted about providing a diagnosis of dementia. She said Holbrook had been under investigation by the state medical board for exactly this kind of unethical practice, providing competency diagnoses for families trying to gain control of elderly relatives' assets, often without properly examining the patient. She offered to evaluate me herself, free of charge, to provide documentation of my actual mental state for the court proceedings. She said it would strengthen the case by definitively proving I had never been declining or incompetent, that Brandon's planned narrative was entirely fabricated. I agreed, and spent 3 hours in her office the following week undergoing cognitive tests, memory assessments, and psychological evaluations. Dr. Vasquez was thorough and professional, treating me with the respect of one professional evaluating another. When she finished, she smiled and told me my cognitive function was not just normal for my age, it was exceptional. She said my memory, reasoning ability, and mental acuity tested in the superior range. She joked that I was sharper than most of her 50-year-old patients. Then she said something that became crucial to the case. She told me that based on Brandon's emails and the evidence I'd provided, she could testify that the plan to have me diagnosed with dementia constituted medical fraud and elder abuse through psychological manipulation. The mere attempt to falsely portray me as incompetent, even if it hadn't succeeded, was itself a crime. This opened up additional charges that Detective Morrison hadn't initially considered. Brandon and Melissa weren't just guilty of the poisoning attempt, they were guilty of conspiracy to commit medical fraud and conspiracy to illegally obtain guardianship through false pretenses. Vincent filed motions to add these charges, and the district attorney, seeing the mounting evidence and public interest, agreed immediately. The case was growing stronger, more comprehensive, more impossible for Brandon to defend against. But the resource I'm most proud of securing had nothing to do with evidence or charges or documentation. It came from my own 3 other children. Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer asked to meet with me one evening, all 3 together. I expected them to be struggling with divided loyalties, torn between supporting me and protecting their brother. Families often fracture in situations like this, with some members defending the accused and others supporting the victim. Instead, they told me they wanted to testify against Brandon if it went to trial. Sarah, crying but steady, said she'd been reviewing her own interactions with Brandon over the past year. She'd noticed him asking pointed questions about my finances, my health, my plans. At the time, she'd thought he was being a concerned son. Now she realized he'd been gathering intelligence, planning his attack. Michael admitted that Brandon had approached him 6 months earlier with a disturbing conversation. Brandon had suggested they should all start thinking about protecting Mom's assets and considering what happens if she starts declining. Michael had shut down the conversation, thinking Brandon was being morbidly premature. Now he understood it had been recruitment. Brandon, testing whether Michael would join the scheme. Jennifer revealed that Melissa had made comments about my retirement party outfit, suggesting I looked confused and not quite myself at a family dinner 2 weeks before the event. Jennifer had defended me, saying I looked beautiful and happy. Now she realized Melissa had been planting seeds, establishing a narrative of decline that didn't exist. My other children had all, independently, noticed pieces of Brandon's plan. They just hadn't connected the dots until the poisoning brought everything into focus. And now they wanted to testify, to show the court that Brandon's narrative of a declining, incompetent mother was a fabrication contradicted by everyone who actually spent time with me. That night, sitting in my living room with my 3 remaining children, I felt something shift. The isolation I'd felt since the arrest, a sense that I was fighting alone against family dissolve. I wasn't alone. I had witnesses who would speak truth, who would validate my competence and expose Brandon's lies. Vincent later told me that having family members willing to testify against a defendant was incredibly powerful in court. It showed that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a family dispute. It was a clear-cut case of one person's criminal actions that even his own siblings condemned. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold October morning. I wore a navy suit, professional, composed, the same kind of outfit I'd worn to depositions for 30 years. I walked into that courtroom with Vincent beside me, my 3 children behind me, and a folder of evidence that could fill a filing cabinet. Brandon and Melissa were already there, seated with their court-appointed attorneys. Brandon had lost weight in jail. He looked older, diminished, nothing like the confident man who'd walked into my retirement party planning to poison me. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even satisfaction, just a cold, clear certainty that I was doing exactly what needed to be done. The judge reviewed the evidence. Vincent presented the documentation, methodically the lab results, the emails, Brandon's confession, Dr. Vasquez's competency evaluation, the financial records showing motive. The prosecuting attorney called Detective Morrison to describe the investigation. Brandon's attorney tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the switched glasses couldn't be definitively proven. But then the prosecutor played the recording from the hospital, Brandon's own voice, admitting everything, explaining the plan in detail. The judge listened to the entire recording without expression. When it ended, he looked at Brandon with something close to disgust and ruled that there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. He denied bail reduction, citing the severity of the crime and the defendant's continued financial desperation as a flight risk. As we left the courthouse, reporters called out questions. I stopped on the steps not because I wanted attention, but because I'd learned that visibility was power. I made a brief statement thanking Detective Morrison and the district attorney's office, and saying that I hoped my case would encourage other elderly victims to come forward. Then I went home, made myself a cup of tea, and sat in the kitchen where I'd raised 4 children. 3 of them were still mine in every way that mattered. One of them had tried to poison me for money, but I had secured every resource I needed to ensure justice: evidence, expert testimony, family support, public awareness, legal momentum, and most importantly, I had secured something Brandon had tried to take from me: my dignity, my competence, my right to my own life. At 73, I'd built the strongest case of my career. And this time, the fraud I'd caught wasn't hiding in corporate spreadsheets. It was sitting in a jail cell, finally facing consequences. The trial was scheduled for January, 3 months away. Vincent explained that Brandon's attorneys would likely push for a plea deal once they realized how insurmountable the evidence was. Most criminal cases never make it to trial, he told me, because defendants eventually recognize they can't win and negotiate for reduced sentences instead. But I didn't want a plea deal. I wanted a trial. I wanted everything Brandon had done laid out in open court, documented in public record, impossible to minimize or explain away. Vincent warned me that trials are unpredictable, that juries can be swayed by emotional appeals, that watching my son testify and potentially lie under oath would be devastating. I told him I'd spent 50 years in courtrooms watching corporate criminals try to talk their way out of fraud charges. I could handle watching my son do the same. What I didn't tell Vincent was that I was waiting for something. A crack in Brandon's defense. A moment of weakness I could exploit, because despite all the evidence, despite the confession, I knew Brandon. I'd raised him, and I knew he still believed, deep down, that somehow he could fix this. That his mother would eventually break, would forgive, would drop the charges, because that's what mothers do. He was counting on maternal instinct overriding justice. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. The crack appeared in mid-November, 6 weeks before trial. Brandon's attorney contacted Vincent with a message. Brandon wanted to speak with me, alone, no lawyers present, just mother and son. Vincent immediately told me it was a terrible idea, that anything I said could be used against me, that Brandon was likely trying to manipulate me into showing mercy. But I saw something Vincent didn't. This wasn't just a legal strategy. This was Brandon's last desperate attempt to reset our relationship to what it had been, to remind me that he was my child and I was supposed to protect him. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when Brandon would reveal just how little he understood about what he'd actually done. I agreed to the meeting, but on my terms. It would happen in a conference room at the police station, with Detective Morrison observing from behind two-way glass. Everything would be recorded. Vincent would be present but silent unless I signaled otherwise, and I would control the conversation entirely. Brandon's attorney didn't like these conditions, but Brandon overruled him. He wanted to see me badly enough to accept my terms. That told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. He was still thinking of me as his mother first, as his victim second. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. I dressed carefully, not in the professional suits I'd been wearing to court appearances, but in the kind of outfit I'd worn to family dinners. A soft cardigan, comfortable slacks, my reading glasses on a chain. I wanted to look like the mother Brandon remembered, the one he thought he could still appeal to. I arrived at the police station early. Detective Morrison briefed me on what to expect, reminding me that I could end the meeting at any time, that I shouldn't let Brandon manipulate me emotionally. I appreciated her concern, but she didn't understand. I wasn't going into this meeting to be manipulated. I was going in to gather the final piece of evidence I needed, because I'd realized something important in the months since the poisoning. Brandon's attorney would argue at trial that this was a moment of desperate panic, that Brandon was under extreme financial pressure and made a terrible mistake, that he never really intended to hurt me. They'd paint him as a good son who made one catastrophic error in judgment under unbearable stress. But I knew that wasn't true. The emails, the planning, the conspiracy with Melissa, this hadn't been a panicked mistake. It had been calculated, methodical, sustained over months. And I needed Brandon to admit that in his own words, to say something that would destroy any sympathy a jury might have for him. They brought Brandon into the conference room in his orange jail jumpsuit. He'd lost more weight. His hair, always so carefully styled, was unkempt. He looked at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate, and I felt that old maternal peltha instinct to comfort my child who was suffering. I smothered it. This wasn't my child anymore. This was a man who'd tried to destroy me. We sat across from each other at a plain table, Vincent to my right, Brandon's attorney to his left. The recording light blinked red in the corner. Detective Morrison was behind the mirror, watching. Brandon spoke first, his voice cracking. He told me he was sorry, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd never meant for things to go this far. He said the financial pressure had been crushing him, that he'd felt trapped, that he'd convinced himself I wouldn't really be hurt, just sedated temporarily, just until he could sort out his problems. He said he loved me, that I was his mother, and he'd never wanted to actually harm me. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt, didn't react, just watched him perform the apology he thought would save him. When he finally stopped, waiting for my forgiveness, I spoke for the first time. I asked him a simple question. When had he stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a problem to solve? Brandon's face crumpled. He insisted that wasn't true, that he'd always seen me as his mother, that this whole thing had been about protecting the family's future. I pressed harder. I asked him about the emails I'd found, the ones where he'd discussed my cognitive decline that didn't exist, where he'd researched nursing facilities, where he'd calculated how much of my money he could access before my other children noticed. I asked him to explain how that was about protecting me. His attorney tried to intervene, but Brandon waved him off. He wanted to explain. He needed me to understand. And that's when he said it, that thing that would destroy any jury sympathy, the admission I'd been waiting for. He told me he'd thought I'd be better off, that at my age, I didn't really need to be managing my own finances anymore, that it was too much stress for someone in their 70s, that by taking control of my assets, he'd actually been helping me, relieving me of burdens I shouldn't have to carry at my stage of life, that the nursing facility he'd researched was nice, comfortable, a place where I could relax and be taken care of without worrying about investments and decisions and all the complicated things that were too much for elderly people to handle. He said this completely seriously, like he believed it, like he'd convinced himself that poisoning me and stealing my autonomy was actually a kindness. I let the silence stretch out, let that statement hang in the air, recorded for posterity. Then, I asked him one more question. I asked if he'd ever considered that maybe I liked managing my own finances, that maybe, after 50 years as an accountant, I was actually good at it. That maybe I didn't want or need to be relieved of burdens by a son who'd lost $680,000 in cryptocurrency schemes. Brandon's face flushed. And then finally, the truth emerged. He told me I was being selfish, that I was sitting on over $1 million while his family was losing their house, that I could help them but chose not to, that I was more concerned with taking European vacations than helping my own grandchildren. He said I'd changed after Dad died, become harder, less family-oriented, more focused on myself. He said I wasn't the mother he remembered anymore. There it was. The real motivation under all the planning and lies. Brandon hadn't just wanted my money. He'd wanted to punish me for having my own life, for not being the selfless, sacrificing mother who existed only to serve her children's needs, for daring to spend my own money on myself instead of reserving it for his emergencies. I'd stopped playing the role he needed me to play, so he'd decided to force me back into it. The nursing facility wasn't just about access to my money, it was about putting me back where elderly mothers belonged, quiet and controlled and grateful for whatever crumbs of attention their children provided. I stood up then. I looked at my son, my firstborn, the baby I'd loved for 47 years, and I told him something I needed him to understand. I told him that I had changed after his father died, that losing Tommy had taught me life was finite, that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, that spending my remaining years trying to please children who saw me as an obligation wasn't how I wanted to live. I told him I'd earned every dollar in my accounts, that they represented 50 years of work and sacrifice and smart decisions, and that I had every right to spend them on whatever brought me joy. I told him that I wasn't selfish for wanting to live my own life. He was selfish for thinking my life belonged to him. Then I told him I'd see him at trial, and I walked out of that conference room with my head high and my purpose clear. Vincent caught up with me in the parking lot. He was almost laughing with disbelief. He told me that Brendan had just handed us the trial on a recording, that his entitlement, his anger at my independence, his belief that elderly people should be controlled for their own good, would destroy any sympathy the jury might have had. Detective Morrison called later that evening. She said that in 20 years of investigating elder abuse, she'd never heard a defendant articulate so clearly the ageist attitudes that enable these crimes. She said Brandon's recorded statement would become a teaching tool, an example of how perpetrators justify exploitation by framing elderly autonomy as a burden rather than a right. But the call that mattered most came from Sarah. She'd heard about the meeting Vincent had, updated my other children with my permission, and she wanted me to know something. She told me she was proud of me, that watching me refuse to minimize Brandon's crime, refuse to protect him from consequences, refused to accept his narrative that I was the problem, it had taught her something about self-respect and boundaries that she'd needed to learn. She said that for years, she'd watched me put everyone else first, raise 4 kids while working full-time, care for Tommy through his illness, help with grandchildren, always available, always accommodating, and she'd internalized that as what mothers should be, selfless to the point of self-erasure. But seeing me now, at 73, finally putting my own needs first, fighting for my own rights, refusing to be diminished, was showing her that women don't have an expiration date, that asserting your needs isn't selfish, that you can be a good mother and still have a self worth protecting. That phone call meant more to me than any legal victory could, because it proved that even out of this ugly situation, something valuable was emerging, a different model of what aging could look like, what being a woman at 73 could mean. Not waiting quietly for death, not existing only to serve younger generations, not accepting diminishment as inevitable, but living, fully, fiercely, on my own terms. The trial date approached. Brendan's attorney made one last attempt at a plea deal, reduced charges, in exchange for pleading guilty, avoiding trial entirely. Vincent brought me the offer. Brandon would plead to lesser charges, serve 18 months, pay restitution. I turned it down immediately, because this was never just about Brandon's punishment. It was about the public record, about other elderly people seeing that you can fight back, about establishing legal precedent for cases like mine, and because Brandon needed to stand in open court and have his actions examined in detail, have a jury of his peers judge him, have the full weight of the justice system confirm what he'd done. He'd tried to make me invisible, incompetent, erased. I was going to make sure he was seen clearly by everyone. The weekend before trial, I did something I hadn't done since Tommy died. I looked through our old photo albums, pictures of Brandon as a baby, as a child, as a teenager. I found my favorite photo of him at age 8, gap-toothed and happy, holding up a math test with a perfect score, so proud of himself, so innocent. I cried for that little boy, the one I'd raised with so much love and hope, but I didn't cry for the man he'd become. That man had made his choices, and now he'd face the consequences. At 73, I'd learned that love and accountability aren't opposites, that you can grieve for who someone used to be while still holding them responsible for who they are now. And I'd learned that the perfect moment for justice isn't when it's easy or painless, it's when it's necessary. Tomorrow, we'd go to trial, and I was ready. The courthouse was packed. The morning trial began. Word had spread through our community, the local papers had been covering the case, and apparently elder abuse trials were rare enough to draw attention. I walked through a gauntlet of cameras and reporters, Vincent's hand steady on my elbow, and I kept my head high because I'd learned something important over these months. Visibility was power, and I wouldn't hide from what was happening. The jury selection had taken 2 days. Vincent had worked methodically to find people who understood that elderly victims could be sharp, competent, capable of defending themselves. We'd rejected potential jurors who seemed to have patronizing attitudes toward aging, who used phrases like "poor thing" when referring to me, who assumed that being 73 meant I needed protection rather than justice. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. They laid out the timeline: the retirement party, the poisoning attempt, the switched glasses, the hospital. The discovered conspiracy. They presented me not as a fragile victim, but as a forensic accountant who'd spent 50 years catching criminals and had simply applied those skills to catching her own son. Brandon's attorney tried a different approach. He painted Brandon as a desperate man who'd made a terrible mistake under crushing financial pressure, who'd never intended real harm, who was being prosecuted by a mother who couldn't forgive a moment of weakness. He suggested I was being vindictive, that families should resolve these matters privately, that destroying my son's life over one terrible decision wasn't justice, it was revenge. I sat in the witness box 3 hours into the trial, my hand on the Bible, and I swore to tell the truth. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp woman named Jennifer Costa, walked me through my testimony with precision that reminded me of depositions I'd given in corporate fraud cases. I described the retirement party, the poisoning, the switch. I explained my decades as a forensic accountant, how I'd been trained to preserve evidence and document suspicious behavior. I walked them through finding the emails, the conspiracy, the planned medical fraud. Then Jennifer Costa asked me the question that cut to the heart of everything. She asked me to describe how it felt to watch my son drink from the poisoned glass, knowing what was about to happen to him. The courtroom went silent. Even Brandon's attorney stopped shuffling papers. Everyone wanted to know had I felt satisfaction, revenge, maternal guilt for not stopping him. I looked at the jury and told them the truth. I said I'd felt grief, profound, crushing grief, because in that moment, I'd understood that my son, the baby I'd nursed, the child I'd raised, the man I'd been proud of, had stopped seeing me as a person. I'd become an obstacle to him, a resource to be exploited, a problem to eliminate. I said watching him drink that poison was like watching him kill the relationship we'd had. Not me killing it, him. With his choices, his conspiracy, his fundamental belief that my life at 73 was worth less than his financial convenience. Several jurors were crying. Even the judge looked affected. Brandon's attorney tried to recover during cross-examination. He suggested I could have stopped Brandon from drinking, that I'd chosen to let him poison himself as a form of entrapment, that I was partially responsible for his hospitalization. I looked at him calmly and explained that if I'd confronted Brandon about the poison before he drank it, he would have denied everything. There would have been no evidence, no confession, no way to prove what he'd intended. He would have tried again, more carefully, and next time I might not have caught him. The attorney asked if I'd considered that my son might have died from the overdose. I told him that Brandon had calculated the dosage to safely sedate a 73-year-old woman weighing approximately 130 pounds. Brandon weighed 190 pounds. The dosage that would have dangerously impaired me was merely strongly sedating for him. Brandon had done the math himself. He'd just been hoisted by his own petard. The attorney looked frustrated. He tried another angle, suggesting I was seeking revenge for years of perceived slights, that this prosecution was about control rather than justice. I smiled, then couldn't help it and told him something Vincent had coached me never to say in court, but that I couldn't hold back. I told him that I'd spent 50 years prosecuting fraud. I'd helped send embezzlers to prison, exposed corporate theft, dismantled financial conspiracies. I'd never once sought revenge against any of them. This wasn't about revenge. This was about the same thing. I'd spent my career fighting for accountability. The fact that this criminal happened to be my son didn't change the nature of the crime or the necessity of consequences. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I could feel the energy in that courtroom. The jury wasn't seeing a vindictive mother. They were seeing a professional who'd caught a criminal, and the tragedy was that the criminal was her child. Detective Morrison testified next, describing the investigation, the evidence, the confession. Then came Dr. Vasquez, who explained my cognitive evaluation and testified that I showed no signs whatsoever of mental decline. She methodically destroyed Brandon's planned narrative that I was becoming incompetent, presenting test results that proved my mental acuity was exceptional for any age. The prosecutor played the recorded confession from the hospital, Brandon's own voice, admitting the entire plot. Then they played the recording from our meeting at the police station, where Brandon had revealed his resentment of my independence, his belief that I should be relieved of burdens, his anger that I was spending my own money on myself. That second recording was the revelation that changed everything. I watched the jury's faces shift from sympathy to disgust as they heard Brandon explain that he'd actually been trying to help me, that taking control of my life was for my own good, that I was selfish for wanting to maintain my autonomy at 73. One juror, a woman in her 60s, looked at Brandon with such pure contempt that I knew we'd won. My other 3 children testified. Sarah described Brandon's suspicious questions about my finances. Michael recounted Brandon's attempt to recruit him into questioning my competency. Jennifer explained Melissa's comments about me looking confused at family events where I'd been perfectly lucid. Each testimony built the same picture. This hadn't been a moment of panic, but a sustained conspiracy that Brandon had tried to involve others in, that he'd planned meticulously, that reflected a deep belief that I no longer deserved control over my own life. The defense called Brandon to the stand on the 4th day of trial. His attorney had clearly coached him to appear remorseful, humble, broken by what he'd done, but cross-examination destroyed that carefully constructed image. Jennifer Costa asked Brandon to explain the emails where he'd researched nursing facilities. He tried to frame it as concern for my future care. She asked why he'd been researching facilities weeks before he'd ever expressed any concern about my cognitive health to family members. He stumbled, contradicted himself. She asked him about the corrupt psychiatrist he'd contacted. He claimed he'd just been looking for someone to evaluate me if I started declining. She asked why he'd specifically sought out Dr. Holbrook, who was under investigation for providing false diagnoses in guardianship cases. Brandon had no good answer. Then she asked the question that ended the trial, really. She asked Brandon if he'd considered that his mother might not want to be institutionalized, even if she was declining, which she wasn't. Brandon actually said in open court that what I wanted wasn't really the point, that when elderly people start losing capacity, families have to make hard decisions for their own good, even if they don't understand or agree. Costa let that statement hang in the air for a long moment. Then she asked him to confirm that his mother had never shown any signs of declining capacity, that he'd planned to manufacture evidence of incompetence that didn't exist, that he'd been willing to imprison a healthy, competent woman in a nursing facility against her will, solely to access her money. Brandon tried to walk it back, but the damage was done. He'd revealed exactly what Costa needed him to reveal, that his belief in his right to control my life superseded any concern for my actual well-being or autonomy. The defense rested after 3 days of testimony that had only made things worse. Brandon's attorney had tried to humanize him, to show the financial pressure he was under, to paint this as a tragic mistake by a good man in desperate circumstances. But every witness they called, every excuse they made, just reinforced the same truth. Brandon had believed his financial needs trumped my right to my own life, and he'd been willing to destroy me, not kill me, but destroy the person I was to get what he thought he deserved. Closing arguments happened on a Friday morning. Costa's closing was masterful. She didn't ask for sympathy for an elderly victim. She asked for accountability for a calculated crime. She pointed out that this case wasn't about a family dispute. It was about premeditated assault, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted medical abuse. She reminded the jury that I'd spent 50 years catching criminals exactly like Brandon P. Al, who believed their needs justified other people's suffering, who used manipulation and false documentation to commit theft, who counted on their victims being too confused or intimidated to fight back. She said the only thing unusual about this case was that I'd caught this particular criminal before he succeeded, and that the fact he was my son didn't make the crime less serious, it made it worse, because he'd weaponized my maternal love, counted on my forgiveness, assumed that being family meant immunity from consequences. Brandon's attorney made one last attempt to appeal to family loyalty, to suggest that prison would destroy Brandon's life and deprive his children of their father. He asked the jury to consider whether justice required such harsh punishment for a man who'd admitted his mistake and apologized. But the jury had heard Brandon's apology. They'd heard him explain that he'd actually been trying to help me, that I was selfish, that elderly people should accept being controlled for their own good, and they'd seen through it completely. Deliberation took less than 3 hours. When the jury came back, their faces were set and certain. The 4 persons stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Attempted assault on an elderly person, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted medical fraud, conspiracy to illegally obtain guardianship. The courtroom erupted. Brandon's face went gray. Melissa, watching from the gallery, started sobbing. My 3 other children squeezed my hands, and I sat there, 73 years old, watching the justice system confirm what I'd known all along, that I mattered, that crimes against elderly people were serious crimes, That being someone's mother didn't mean accepting abuse without consequences. The judge set sentencing for 4 weeks later. As we filed out of the courtroom, a reporter called out asking how I felt about my son's conviction. I stopped on the courthouse steps and told her exactly how I felt. I felt sad that it had come to this, but I felt certain that I'd done the right thing, because somewhere out there, another elderly person would hear about this case and realize they didn't have to accept being exploited. That age didn't make you powerless, that you could fight back and win. I said that if my family's tragedy could help even one other person stand up against elder abuse, then something good had emerged from something terrible. The cameras recorded every word, and I hoped Brandon was watching, understanding finally that he hadn't poisoned a confused old woman who'd go quietly. He'd poisoned Patricia Brennan, forensic accountant, fraud investigator, and woman who'd spent 5 decades proving that the truth always comes out in the end, especially when it destroys your own family to reveal it. Sentencing day arrived on a cold January morning. Brandon stood before the judge wearing the same orange jumpsuit he'd worn throughout the trial, and I sat in the gallery watching the final chapter of this nightmare unfold. The judge didn't mince words. He told Brandon that crimes against elderly family members represented a profound betrayal of trust, that Brandon had attempted to steal not just money but his mother's autonomy, dignity, and remaining years. He noted that the premeditation, the conspiracy, and Brandon's complete lack of genuine remorse demonstrated by his recorded statements, blaming me for being selfish, warranted the maximum sentence. 3 years in state prison. Mandatory restitution for legal costs and Dr. Vasquez's evaluation. 5 years probation after release. And a permanent restraining order. Brandon couldn't contact me for the rest of my life unless I initiated it. Melissa, who'd taken a plea deal in exchange for testimony, received 2 years probation and 300 hours of community service at senior care facilities. The judge told her perhaps working with elderly people would teach her what she'd failed to learn from being married into a family, that aging doesn't diminish human worth. I felt no satisfaction watching Brandon led away in handcuffs, but I felt something more important: resolution. This chapter was closed. The weeks following sentencing brought unexpected peace. I'd spent months consumed by investigation, trial preparation, and court appearances. Now, suddenly, my time was my own again. I could finally return to the retirement I'd planned before Brandon poisoned it. Literally, I booked a trip to Italy. 2 months, traveling solo, seeing places Tommy and I had dreamed about. My other children worried, was I safe traveling alone at 73? I reminded them I'd just taken down a criminal conspiracy while they were still figuring out what was happening. Italy would be fine. The educational trusts I'd established for my grandchildren were ironclad. Brandon's 3 kids would have college fully funded, but their parents couldn't touch a penny. My lawyer had structured it so that when each grandchild turned 18, they'd receive a letter from me explaining what happened, not to poison them against their father, but to teach them that integrity matters more than money, and that respecting elderly people isn't optional kindness, it's basic human decency. I revised my will completely. Brandon was removed entirely. My estate would be split among my 3 other children, with substantial donations to elder abuse prevention organizations and legal aid societies that help seniors fight financial exploitation. But the most meaningful change happened in my daily life. I started volunteering at the senior center, talking with other elderly people about financial safety, recognizing exploitation, understanding their rights. The stories I heard were heartbreaking. So many people being taken advantage of by family members, afraid to report it, ashamed to admit it, convinced they were overreacting. I told them about Brandon, about the poisoning, the trial, the conviction, and I watched their faces change from shame to recognition to determination. If Patricia Brennan could prosecute her own son, maybe they could confront their nephew who'd stolen their credit cards. Maybe they could report the daughter forging checks. Maybe they deserved protection too. Today, at 73, I'm living the life I always planned. I traveled through Tuscany last spring, spent a month in France this fall, and I'm planning a trip to Greece next year. I have dinner with Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer regularly. I spoil my grandchildren, the ones whose parents haven't tried to poison me, and I've made peace with the fact that one of my children is simply lost to me. Sometimes people ask if I regret prosecuting Brandon, if I wish I'd handled it privately. if I feel guilty about his imprisonment. The answer is no, because Brandon didn't make one mistake in a moment of panic. He made dozens of calculated decisions over months, each one confirming that he valued my money more than my humanity. And here's what I've learned in these years since my retirement party. Respect isn't automatic just because you're someone's mother, and forgiveness isn't mandatory just because you're family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the people who might become future victims is to say no, to draw a line, to demand accountability. I'm 73 years old, and I've never felt more powerful, more certain of who I am, or more determined to live every remaining day on my own terms. Brandon tried to take that from me. Instead, he gave me something unexpected: absolute clarity about what matters. Not money, not even family, if that family doesn't see your worth, but dignity, autonomy, the right to live your own life until the very end, without apologizing for taking up space or spending your own money, or refusing to disappear quietly into some nursing home because it's convenient for someone else. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, or if you know someone being exploited by family, hope you'll subscribe to hear more stories like mine, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I'd love to know this message is reaching people everywhere who need to hear it. Every grandmother has a story. Mine just happens to end with justice, independence, and a one-way ticket to anywhere I want to go. Brandon thought he could poison my future. Instead, he freed me to live it completely.